We go first now to the Colombian drug story. As we reported, Colombian President Virgilio Barco today called on other nations to join the fight against the powerful drug lords of the Medellin cartel. He warned that the cartel threatens the very existence of Colombia as a democracy. Here is an excerpt from President Barco's unusual televised appeal to the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am choosing this unusual means to speak directly to you because of the tragic events we have suffered in Colombia. This is an appeal for your understanding and your support. A young senator and presidential candidate, Luis Carlos Galán, as you saw on your televisions, was viciously gunned down by hitmen from the narcotics cartel who are at war with our country. His cruel death put our whole country in mourning, but it also united us in our resolve to destroy this worldwide criminal enterprise. He was the latest of thousands of Colombian martyrs who have given their lives in the fight against drugs. They are your heroes too, because this is a common enemy and a common war. We may have borne the brunt of the violence, but it does not stop at our borders. The cartels fight back against our police and military because narcos are protecting a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that is funded by the cocaine habit of some of you which are watching me now. Those of you who depend on cocaine have created the largest, most vicious criminal enterprise the world has ever known. What might seem to be a matter of a pure personal habit has had explosive public consequences. It has thrown us all into a war we did not ask for. Colombia's survival as the oldest democracy in Latin America is now at risk, but also is the safety of your streets. Thousands of Colombians have died at the hands of the cartel, killed because they will not give into the intimidation or bribery. The cartel must know that their fight is not with us alone. The world is united in its outrage and in solidarity with us in what we are doing. The narco-traffickers must come to understand that they are taking on all of you when they attack us, that we are not fighting them alone. They must understand that they are international fugitives on the run from civilized society everywhere. There is no home for them. There should be no market for them. Over the last several days, we have had close cooperation with the United States in developing an emergency package of aid and assistance. I want to express my gratitude to President Bush and the American people for their strong support. In this regard, $65 million in emergency assistance, including 20 helicopters, aircraft, and other equipment, is being made available to Colombia. Of course, even more important than our joint effort to reduce supply are your efforts to cut demand. We can never finally destroy the narco traffic while the illegal profits remain so great. Somewhere, some country, if not Colombia, then somewhere else, will continue to be terrorized by drug cartels until people stop using these illegal drugs. The time will come when our shared torment will be lifted, when respect for one another, justice and freedom will prevail. That day will come. If we do not waver in our conviction, if we are all willing to stand up to this menace, if we do not despair, let us vow to each do our part so that these brave Colombians will not have died in vain. Together, we can rid the world of this scourge.
President Barco's Justice Minister, Monica de Graef, was in Washington today to talk with U.S. officials about the anti-drug fight. U.S. government officials went out of their way today to deny reports she had resigned after receiving death threats. For more on the drug war, we turn now to the top U.S. law enforcement official, Attorney General Dick Thornburgh. Mr. Attorney General, thank you for being with us. That's an extraordinary appeal for the president of another country to make, speaking in English to American citizens, among others. Why do you think he did that?
Well, it was a very eloquent appeal and made by a man of considerable courage, considering what's happened in Colombia in recent weeks. It's quite clear that President Barco sees the current situation as a real turning point for his country. They must either face down these thugs who've attempted to take over their country, or they face a prolonged period of utter chaos. And I believe his appeal to the world community is designed to enlist the support that's necessary for them to be able to accomplish this, for they can't do it on their own.
Well, do you think he was really trying to reach drug users? I mean, he said to those, some of you who are listening who use drugs. I mean, do you think that's really literal?
I hope he was, because it's about time that we recognize where a major portion of the responsibility for the violence that exists in Colombia and the violence that exists in many of our communities here in the United States. Every cocaine sniffer and crack smoker in this country has to take some of the responsibility for the loss of life and the erosion of the governmental institutions in Colombia.
Do you agree with his point that cutting demand is more important than any effort to reduce supply?
I think that we have to look at this, as I believe the President will stress in his speech next week, as a comprehensive approach.
President Bush.
Yes. It's very difficult to weigh the factors, but it's not difficult at all to figure out that a strong law enforcement effort has to be complemented by an equally strong commitment to reducing the appetite, the consumption of drugs in this country and worldwide. And I think one of the promising factors is the world attention that is focused on this problem. In the last year, I've had conversations with 36 of my counterparts in the law enforcement community around the world. And as the drug appetite in other countries increases, as the violence that accompanies it inevitably increases, more and more countries are cognizant of the fact that they can't deal with this problem on their own any more than we can, and it takes an international effort.
But here's the president of a country that you just announced last week we were giving, the White House just announced last week we were giving $65 million worth of military aid to anti-tank weapons, helicopters, grenade launchers, to the president of this country, who's now saying that it's more important to aim at the demand than it is to cut the supply.
I'm not sure he was saying it was more important. I think he's saying it's equally important. In economics, the first thing we learn is about the law of supply and demand. And if there were no appetite for drugs in this country primarily, but around the world, there'd be no market for these billion-dollar narco traffickers. And clearly, while we have to keep the heat on them, we have to supply and support our Colombian counterparts in their efforts to confiscate and seize the assets of the traffickers and arrest them. And we have to undertake efforts to extradite them for trial to this country when they're taken into custody. In the long run, it is a problem of attacking the demand side. And to do that in this country is going to take a concerted effort by all of us.
You met, as we mentioned, with Colombia's Justice Minister, Ms.
Yes.
de Graef, today. What did you talk about? What was she asking for? What is Colombia asking for beyond what we've already given?
Well, it was a working session, Judy. We got down to the specifics of the kinds of things that we can do to help Colombia. We looked at some of the details of the decree that President Barco issued last week in connection with their law enforcement efforts in cooperation with our own law enforcement efforts.
You mean the extradition arrangements?
Secondly, we discussed our commitment to help in the protection of their judiciary and the reestablishment of the rule of law. Judges, prosecutors, police officers, public officials have not only been intimidated but assassinated on a regular basis, and we're going to work with them and with other countries who have had experience in dealing with this kind of terroristic assault on their system.
What do you mean? You mean when beefing up security for these
beefing up
people?
security, providing training for judges and security officials, providing the hardware that's necessary.
You mean training them to duck, or I mean what?
Training them to see in the conduct of their daily lives what pitfalls are there. I mean, there are countries who've had a lot of experience in this regard. Fortunately, not in the United States, although we have contingency plans in this regard. But in recent months, Italian law enforcement authorities have had to deal with the Sicilian mafia, Spanish law enforcement authorities who have dealt with the terrorists and the Basque separatist movement from the United Kingdom who have dealt with the Provisional Irish Republican Army. The attack on the system is unfortunately not a rare phenomenon in this world, and it's I think, as President Barco suggested, time for all of us who are concerned about the rule of law and the sanctity of the system that we've established to administer justice to pull together.
You all made a point today of saying, the U.S. administration, the Colombian administration made a point today of saying that Ms. de Graef had not resigned, that she was remaining in her position. I mean, it's your understanding that she will remain, is that right?
We had no discussions about her future. She was here to do business, and we did business, and she was accompanied by military and law enforcement personnel, and as I said, it was a working session.
How much danger is she in?
Well, the track record of the terrorists affiliated with the narcotic traffickers in Colombia is pretty discouraging in that regard. One of her predecessors was assassinated earlier in this decade. A predecessor as Attorney General, about 50 judges, half of the Supreme Court. I mean, is
she in danger when she's here in Washington? I mean, is she...
I think anyone in authority today who has the courage to stand up to the narco traffickers is almost by definition in danger, and they deserve all the more credit and thanks from the world at large for their efforts in view of that danger.
And what about when she goes back to Colombia? You're saying the situation hasn't changed, that she's still threatened when she goes home.
I would expect so, and that's why I think we want to undertake every effort we can to provide for the kind of protection for people who are exposed to this kind of activity as we can.
You said in an interview a week or so ago that the Bush administration would consider sending troops to Colombia because of this whole drug crisis down there. Just today, Newsweek magazine and a Gallup poll came out with a report that 53% of the people surveyed would support sending American troops to a foreign country to help interdict in a drug flow. What does that say to you? I mean, does that say to you that that there's more support out there than you realized? And will the administration look at this again?
I think one thing that has to be emphasized, as the President made clear, is that any use of our military option has to be predicated on a request from the host country. There's never been any suggestion, responsible suggestion that I have heard, to send troops in unilaterally. We have provided military aid to the Colombians in the package that the President sent forward last week. But clearly our preference is, and the current preference of the Colombian government, is to support them in their efforts. And they've indicated that they're willing to go a long way toward stepping up their own law enforcement and military efforts, and they deserve our support. No one is suggesting that, as the popular phrase goes, we should send in the Marines. And there's a great deal of sensitivity on our part about Colombian sovereignty and the need to work with them rather than imposing some kind of solution.
But you said, as I say, a week or so ago, that that was something worth considering.
I said if we had a request from the host country, we would certainly have to consider it. And I think the President indicated that as well. We had no such request, and we're certainly not going to proceed on our own in that regard.
And if the request came down, you would recommend giving it a serious look?
Well, I think it's implicit in the fact that if a country that is under siege asks for assistance, the President would give it serious request. But that's all hypothetical at the moment, and I think what we have to do is concentrate on the task at hand, which is supporting the Colombians in their effort to take back their country.
Well, how much more can the U.S. do? $65 million has already been pledged by the President. As we mentioned, helicopters, anti-tank weapons. We are assisting in the extradition, the legal process. You mentioned we're providing security assistance to the members of the Colombian judiciary. What more can the administration do? The President's going to make a speech, what, a week from tomorrow night? What more can we do?
Well, we went through the strategy that the Colombians are following, and it's really in three parts. Number one is to arrest and incapacitate as much of the drug cartel by seizing their assets and profits as they can in their current crackdown. Secondly, they are opening the window of extradition, as it were, for us to obtain jurisdiction over cartel leaders who face criminal charges in this country. They have to be taken into custody first, but we're processing the first of those extradition requests right now. The third, most important and the toughest task that they've undertaken, and where they need the support of the world community, is to reestablish their own system of justice, because in the long run, that's going to be the only salvation for the country. And we can help in every one of those regards, and I'm sure when I report to the President tomorrow on my meeting with Justice Minister Monica de Graaf that he will have a ready ear and will be able to participate in helping the Colombians in a very, very important task to all of us.
Mr. Attorney General, we thank you for being with us. Robin?
Now, two additional perspectives. Joining us from Chicago is Peter Bensinger, who served 3 presidents as the administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration from 1976 to 81. He currently advises corporations on controlling drug abuse in the workplace. And Bruce Bagley, a specialist in Colombian drug issues and an associate professor of Latin American affairs at the University of Miami in Florida. He joins us from Miami. Mr. Bensinger, how do you think the Bush administration has responded to the latest events in Colombia?
Well, I think we have a turning point opportunity in the United States. President Barco's message was tremendously moving and very important, but we are contributing, principally because of drug use in America, to the violence in Colombia. So we need, number one, user accountability. That is, people using illegal drugs in this country held accountable, punished, jail terms, fines, disincentives, so that there is a realistic reduction in use in this country. And we can't just talk about it. We have to do something about it.
Do you think the administration is underemphasizing that aspect of it so far?
I think the new strategy will very clearly outline a need for user accountability. I think the second point the U.S. has to do is recognize that the $63 million is a drop in the bucket. This is not a one-time, one-shot aid and assistance issue. We need long-term, regional Latin American assistance. Colombia, which has been the source of most of the violence and most of the cocaine, has been receiving about $5 million a year in aid from this country to cope with a $50 billion problem. We've not really looked long-term at helping the Colombians. I think we have to recognize that as the cartels get pressure, they'll move their money, their mercenaries, and their people in laboratories to other countries. So we should anticipate helping Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Central America so they don't have to go through the tragedy and violence and intimidation that Colombia is suffering. And finally, I think we need to look at the source of the drugs in America. 95% of them come from Latin America. And our State Department, our whole government and Congress, I think traditionally has been looking east and west. We need to recognize this is a hemispheric problem, and probably the most important war in this century, certainly in the last 50 years, is the war on drugs.
50 years includes the Second World War.
I think we've got our country's future at stake. And the Second World War was obviously an important turning point in democracy and people being able to exercise their own free rights. President Barco is right. When we take away the oldest democracy in Latin America's ability to have a free election, to have their judges act, you're talking about a major challenge to the rule of law and citizens' ability to govern themselves. The problem is not Colombia's, it's all of ours, and these cartels go from Bogota right up to Boston.
Professor Bagley, do you think $63 million, which the Bush administration has come up with in emergency aid, is a drop in the bucket, that a great deal more is needed?
Well, I think the Bush administration should be congratulated for finally taking at least the beginning of the action that's necessary. Yeah, it's a small amount versus the needs that Colombia has. In the short term, I think it's an excellent thing to have done, but I couldn't agree more. I think that this is a medium and long-term problem. The United States is going to have to sustain aid at much higher levels than it has in the past to have any real impact.
And you would look for some reference to that in the President's big anti-drug speech next week?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think that throughout the Reagan administration we saw rising budgets for the war on drugs, but I think much of that money was misspent. I think that the continued emphasis on interdiction, which captures between 3 and 10% of the drugs entering the country, is fundamentally mistaken. We need to spend far more than we have in the past on the so-called source or producing countries such as Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, many of the Caribbean islands. And it's going to have to be sustained over a lengthy period of time. Anyone who thinks that this war against drugs is going to end tomorrow or next year is sadly mistaken. This is going to be a decades-long war.
You know Colombia very well. Would you answer something that rouses my curiosity? Colombia is a big and prosperous country which has its own armed forces. Why would sending 20 helicopters, for instance, make that much difference to Colombia? It must have lots of helicopters if it chose to take its army's helicopters and put them into the, chasing the drug kingpins. Explain that to me. Why suddenly $65 million in boats and helicopters and machine guns and things is suddenly so important?
Colombia is a large country. It's got 30 million population. It's the 4th largest national territory in the region. And clearly the Colombian military, which has a standing army of some 60,000 individuals, is a fairly large body. The territory is, however, extensive. There are many areas of the Colombian territory that are not controlled at all by the national government. They have for years been sadly lacking in the more sophisticated, high-tech equipment. Helicopters are very expensive, repairs are extremely expensive, skilled mechanics are necessary, so that I don't think your assumption that there are enough helicopters operating in Colombia is correct. Beyond that, Colombia has not a single problem with violence. It's not simply drug traffickers that the government of Colombia confronts. There are at least 5 active guerrilla organizations, left-wing guerrilla organizations, with combined combatants of 8,000 to 10,000. The military has a principal mission in that area. There's also arisen over the last several years right-wing paramilitary organizations in Colombia. Some call them death squads, private armies in the pay of the narcotraficantes. In that sense, the Colombian military has its hands full, and it needs all the equipment and the support that it can get from the United States. I do, however, think that there is an overemphasis in the United States on the impact that the military solutions can have on this problem. The military has an important role, as do the police. But I don't think that we've seen in the past, nor will we see in the future, that the Colombian military is going to be able to match the firepower of the narcotraficantes.
Mr. Bensinger, what is your view of the Attorney General said that the use of U.S. forces would only be appropriate and only considered if it were invited by Colombia. Do you sense behind all this that we're heading towards some invitation from a desperate Colombian government for the use of U.S. forces?
I don't. I think President Barco's invitation was to have the American government really try to police its own streets and reduce the demand. I think they'd like to have more equipment and need it. I think they probably and their neighbors would look to receiving crop substitution, credits for balance of payment, incentives to export legitimate crops rather than a division of Marines.
The sort of things we did in Bolivia, I believe it was, a few years ago, but did send U.S. forces to implement.
Well, the Bolivian Operation Blast Furnace was a specific situation in which helicopters came in and did provide, I think, very quick, fast reacting equipment and some officers to deal with a problem in that country. I think in Colombia our resources would be better in training and intelligence, finding out where the money is moving, where the labs are located, where the narcotic traffickers and cartels are located. Though I don't think Dick Thornburg's reservation about sending troops is misplaced. I think if the Colombian government finds itself in need of people, literally police and law enforcement armies, a regional deployment, including U.S. troops, could well be provided. But I would think that would be a last resort.
What's your view on that, Professor Bagley?
I think the idea of sending American troops to Colombia is really quite foolhardy. The United States troops don't speak Spanish. They don't know the terrain. They would provoke a nationalist sentiment against the United States throughout the country. They would provide an easy target not only for the narcotraficantes, but also for the guerrilla organizations in that country. I think that altogether it's the wrong approach. What we need to be doing in Colombia and in many other Latin American countries is to provide the economic aid that's necessary to begin with. But this is a long-term struggle, and it's going to require serious efforts at institution building. In Colombia, on a multilateral level, the United States has a role to play. The Colombian justice system is virtually in collapse right now. It needs to be strengthened, and that's not a long-term problem, that's a short-term problem. We need to provide armored cars. We need to provide computer systems to computerize the legal system in Colombia. We need to provide protection for judges. We need to provide bodyguards, better trained, who are capable of dealing with the kinds of problems that they're going to confront in Colombia. We need to invent better systems for the rotation of judges and judges' anonymity. We need witness protection programs that perhaps might involve the United States. There are a variety of institutional aspects that must be addressed in the Colombian situation.
And would those be, excuse me interrupting, would those be some of the things that the Lady Justice Minister would have been discussing with Thornburg today? Would that be like?
I'm sure that Monica Greff has been discussing exactly those kinds of problems and looking for something more than the $2 million that the Department of Justice has promised to help support this kind of effort.
Finally, let me ask each of you quickly, do you have much confidence, starting with you, Professor Bagley, that the decree by the President that he's going to reinstate the extradition policy sort of over and above the political system, is that going to work, or is he going to be overruled in the end? What do you think?
I think it's entirely possible that the Colombian justice system could, in fact, overrule that in the end. The Supreme Court of Colombia on 2 separate occasions has struck down previous extradition treaties. The President is moving very rapidly in ways that may well not stand up in court. But beyond that, I think that extradition is only one very small part of a much larger problem. You could extradite 10 or 100. Carlos Lea has already been extradited, and there are many other Colombian narcos that are willing to fill his shoes. People are waiting in line because the industry is extremely profitable. So you take the profits out of the industry, there'll still be other narcos willing to take the risks.
Professor Bagley and Mr. Bensinger, thank you both for joining us. Judy?